Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Autism Hope education page. I am just really excited to introduce our next guest. You've seen him probably many times throughout our Autism Hope summits and some of our other interviews, and he's literally one of our favorites. Dr. Darin Ingels, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, well, thanks for having me back, Kristen. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm really excited because this Autism Hope education page is really our new 2020 kind of where we're going to try to push everybody we can to get them to learn just even one thing. And we never know what that one thing's going to be.
Right.
And today we're going to talk about different types of immune disruptors. And I think that's really important, especially when you're looking at autism. Many people still don't understand that there's this autoimmune component to many of our kids. And so I think today's going to be a very important topic. Before we get started, can you briefly just give them a background of why you're so passionate about helping our kiddos?
Well, I'm an environmental medicine doctor by training, and I learned very early in my career that, kids on the spectrum are really the canaries in the coal mine. All these different things out there in the environment affect them so much more profoundly than it does for other people, and particularly their neurotypic counterparts. So it was very obvious to me that, it was the food, it was the environmental exposure, it's mold, it's chemicals, and, there's sort of this additive effect that, every time they get an exposure, it impacts them more deeply. So I had the opportunity to work with someone in New York City very early in my career who started referring some children with autism my way, and I started realizing everything I was doing in my environmental medicine practice, I was really doing exactly the same with these kids, but it was having such a huge impact on the way they were responding. We were getting better behavior, more language, more cognition, by really just getting down to the fundamental core of what it was that was undermining their immune system. And although kids on the spectrum are so uniquely different, I think the one red line that tends to run through all these kids is that they've got this element of immune dysfunction. So if we could start pinpointing these things that set them off and start treating it, again, we just see a healthier, better functioning child.
And what are some of the biggest triggers that you see with autism?
Gosh, how much time do we have? There's so many. I think, food is probably one of the biggest things that I see that has the biggest impact on kids' health. And if you think about it, it makes so much sense. And, what you're eating, it goes into your gut. Your gut accounts for about 80% of your immune function. So if your gut's not functioning well, then your immune system doesn't function well. And so many of our kids, have some element of gut problems, whether they're constipated or those mushy, sandy poops. But if we can start making sure that they're nutritionally sound, that does help in dealing with leaky gut and some of these gut issues. And for whatever reason, I think it's just sort of in the hardwiring that, these kids are genetically disposed to being sensitive to, food and mold and pollen and dust and things like that. But because food's the one thing you do every day is you eat. And if the child's eating the wrong thing, it can have such a dramatic effect on their behavior, their cognition, their language, their sleep across the board. And, Dr. Theoredes has talked so much about how a lot of these kids have a lot of mast cells in their brain. So when they get allergy reactions, they don't necessarily get hay fever, they'll get neurological symptoms. And that's why we see that neurological impact of these different exposures. So I think, foundationally, if we can help identify, what those food triggers are, it just gives, you, the parent, more power to know what you should be feeding your child and making sure they're staying away from the things that set them off.
And I think it's important too to also mention, when we talk about food allergies, many families will say, oh, but I had a food allergy test.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not intolerant to these foods. And I think that's important to note.
Absolutely. We use the term food allergy very loosely in this country. If you go to an allergist and they test you for food allergies, they're really looking for those reactions that happen within seconds to minutes of eating a food. So these are the kids that get hives and, get swollen eyes, they can't breathe. This is the serious life-threatening kind of stuff. And fortunately, that's actually, not as common. More commonly what we see in kids on the spectrum are what we call food sensitivities or food intolerances. And food intolerances probably speak more to digestive issues where you just don't make enough of the right enzymes to break a food down. So these are things like lactose intolerance or gluten intolerance. That's really an enzyme problem, and the immune thing that happens is secondary. But there are other types of delayed immune reactions, which means if a child eats a food, you may not see that reaction for hours to days after they've eaten it. So as a parent, I think it's really difficult, even if you kept a very detailed diet diary, what's actually setting your child off. Because if a child comes in and says, boy, I see he gets these red ears and red cheeks and his pupils are hugely dilated. And I said, okay, write down everything he's eaten over the last 3 days. What is it? Both you and I are going to be hard pressed to figure out what that is. So, that's where it can be valuable to do some element of testing to try and pinpoint what it actually is that's setting them off.
Absolutely. And it seems like our kids in our community seem to often get sick more often, whether it be with strep throat or bronchitis or ear infections. How as parents, we're parents out there trying to figure out the best way. How do we help prevent that?
Well, I think, what we see is there's this process in our immune system. There's what's called Th1 and Th2. And without making everybody an immunologist, what it boils down to is Th stands for T helper cells. And T helper cells are really the conductors of your immune system. They're what telling the rest of your immune system what they should be reacting to. And when the Th1 system gets activated, that's when you get exposed to a virus or a bacteria. That system gets activated. This is, hey, I see that there's strep there. I need to go after it and get rid of it. And that's a normal, healthy, functioning immune system. But then we have Th2. Th2 is more involved in antibody responses. So antibodies by themselves actually don't do anything. They need sort of a second part of the immune system to help. So the antibodies just kind of alert the rest of the immune system that, hey, there's a problem over here. We need to deal with it. But that Th2 system is really what drives allergy and autoimmunity. And that's the part of the immune system that tends to be more dysfunctional in these kids. But what happens is that Th2 level goes up. It actually suppresses Th1 and vice versa. So, the immune system is supposed to have, very easily we can think of it kind of like a teeter-totter, right? Where each side should be kind of balanced. And if one side's too heavy, it kind of flips the other side. So I think as these kids become more Th2 dominant, we see more allergies, we see more autoimmunity. And so it's really, again, about, if there's a way we can identify the trigger and avoid it, that's always preferable. If it's something we can't avoid, then we need to figure out a way to try and modulate the immune system to get it back into balance.
And I know PANS is a common problem with kids on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
What is causing that?
So PANS, back in the old days, and we called it pandas, right? Because we thought it was just strep. And we've now learned that it's not just strep. There's any number of different microbes which can trigger this reaction. So it's really an autoimmune reaction to that organism that starts cross-reacting with the brain and causing some element of brain inflammation. So that's where we see the OCD, the anxiety, the tics, and that's sort of classic PANS. But I think now we've sort of expanded that definition that we see other types of problems with, focus, memory, concentration, sleep. Depending on what part of the brain gets affected is probably how it's going to manifest with the child. But, again, we've now learned that strep is a cause, Lyme is a cause, Mycoplasma is a cause, Candida is a cause. There's probably any number of different bacteria and viruses and maybe other fungi and parasites that can trigger the reaction. And, Sue Suedo, who's the director at the NIH, who's really the first one that coined that term PANS, she came to a group I was at a couple of years ago and said, hey, look, testing isn't really terribly helpful for PANS. You just have to treat it empirically. And, there's still this controversy in the pediatric world about whether it exists or not, yet we've got mounds of evidence showing that it does. And, talk to any parent who's got a kid with PANS, they will tell you, they can see how clearly it affects their child. But again, I think it kind of comes back to that Th1, Th2 balance. Your immune system is recognizing something that should be normal as being abnormal. And that's why it starts to react that way. So ultimately, we need to retrain the immune system to stop overreacting to these things that are a normal part of their world.
And how do we help treat PANS? Is there certain protocols out there that you feel helps one community or subgroup better than the other?
Yeah, in the conventional world, antibiotics and steroids are the preferable choice to try and, go after, target the organism. If it's strep, if you kill the strep off, there's nothing for the immune system to react to, and therefore it should quiet down. I think what we're seeing experientially, though, is that a lot of these kids, if they do well on antibiotics, once they come off the antibiotics, particularly for something like strep, because for a lot of kids, strep's part of their normal flora, you're never going to get rid of it 100%. And even if you were successful at that, there's going to be another kid that's going to cough on them. They're going to get re-exposed, and that cycle will go on and on. So what we've done in our practice is that we've really focused on not just killing the bug, but actually trying to modulate the way the immune system reacts to the bug. So we've been doing a therapy called LDI, or low dose immunotherapy. And it really is a way of of trying to turn off that overreaction specifically to whatever organism that we're treating. So we can treat strep, we can treat Lyme, we can treat mycoplasma. Each antigen has its own series that we can use to try and help turn off that reaction. And essentially what LDI is it's dead bug that's been irradiated, so it can't replicate, it can't reproduce, it can't cause infection, and we dilute it out millions of times, and then we mix it with an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, and that enzyme actually helps modulate whatever you mix in with it. So if we've done some blood test or a stool test or an oat test that tells me what a child's been exposed to, at least gives me an idea that, okay, this might be a potential trigger. And then we implement the treatment, we give these dilutions, we see how they respond, and when we hit the nail on the head, some cases we'll see these symptoms go away within 24, 48 hours. So it can be really dramatic, when we find the right antigen, right dilution. The biggest challenge to the therapy is, sometimes we get bamboozled and we'll see things on paper that looks like, this might be the big problem. And we might find out it's actually something completely different. And I'll give you just a very quick example. I had a child in my practice years ago that had very classic PANS where overnight OCD, tics, anxiety. I did a blood test. His strep titer was sky high. I said, okay, this is classic pandas. And I treated him for strep and it did absolutely nothing. And then the mom tells me some weeks later that he had Lyme disease when he was 4. And at this point, he was 8 or 9 years old. But he was treated, and as far as she was concerned, he was fine. Well, when I went back and treated him for Lyme, literally within 24 hours, all his symptoms went away 100%.
Wow.
So I think what happened is he got exposed to strep. The strep kicked up his immune system, and that sort of allowed this underlying Lyme to resurface and start to trigger that inflammatory reaction. So, again, sometimes we get a little bamboozled by what we see on paper, but again, it can give us some ideas about what that exposure has been, and at least helps narrow down our target a little bit.
Well, and I think also for those that are watching, especially if you're new to the biomedical world or, whatever we're calling it these days, right? I just like to look at the whole child and treat the whole child of any age. But often I'm still hearing, oh, well, they have OCD or they have tics. That's just part of being autistic. And I just don't feel that, and I know you don't, we look at that as there's something else going on. So I feel like you can have the diagnosis of autism, but you can still have these other characteristics that are popping up, like OCD and such, and that is the cause of something else potentially going on. And that's why it's important to see a doctor like you that can, look at that and go, wait a second, we're not going to just look at the label of autism. We're going to really dive in deeper to figure out the why of this particular symptom. And maybe if we can start helping all these other symptoms, this child of any age, I always like to say, can really start living their best quality of life. And that's what I love what you're doing. I want to talk a little bit about EMFs. I know that this is kind of becoming, or at least in my world, I'm hearing it more and more and more. So it's becoming more of a hot topic if you're in that world. If you're not in that world, you might be thinking, what the heck is an EMF? Is an alien outer space component from, what's happening? So first of all, what is EMS and why should we be looking at that?
Well, EMF stands for electromagnetic frequencies, and this is all that radiation that gets emitted by all of our devices like our iPhones and iPads and routers and cellular devices and things of that nature. And we just live in a world now of technology where we're bombarded with them all over the place. So whether it's something you have personally or whether it's something that may be around where you live or where your child goes to school, I think one of the biggest concerns that's come out in the last year or two that's been of recent concern is the unrolling of 5G network. For 5G to really work, that means they have to put a lot more cell towers out there, and it emits a higher amplitude frequency. So, we have a technology coming out that really hasn't been tested for the long-term health effects. And the fact that they're putting so many more towers out there, and they are putting them in a lot of public places to get this to work. So it's going into schools, it's going into churches, it's going into public buildings. And a lot of people have no idea that these towers are going up in and around their neighborhood. And it's just like everything else, it's the cumulative effect of everything we get exposed to. And I think because a lot of our kids are really the barometers to the world, the effect on them may be a bit different than other people who aren't quite as sensitive. But I think, I was at a conference earlier this year that they brought in all the experts on electromagnetic radiation in the world to come talk. And the data at this point is clear. I mean, I won't even say it's controversial anymore. We know that the impact, particularly on children, is detrimental. When these kids start getting, early screen time, so if they're giving iPads, iPhones when they're 2 years old, 3 years old, it is affecting their brains in a negative way. So, the recommendations now are pretty much to not let any child under the age of certainly 2 ever have any kind of electronic device at all, no screen time at all. And then, as they get older, it's very, very limited screen time. And when they do, there are now ways that you can hardline just about anything so that you're not using the wireless network to connect. Maybe a bit more inconvenient, but it's much safer for the child and even other people who are using these devices. So, we've got this whole emerging field that's really, I think, in its infancy and being understood about the long-term health effects. I mean, remember when cell phones came out, right? There was a concern, is it causing brain cancer, is it causing tumors as you're holding this up to your head? And I think the jury's still out on that. But again, we've got some pretty compelling evidence that it is dangerous. It probably is linked to certain types of cancer. And they've done other studies where they look at how it impacts the heat pattern of the brain. Definitely heats your head up. And what does that do long term? I think we're still trying to figure that out. But for our kids, because of their sensitivity level, I do have concerns about how all these different devices impact their health. And I think if we want to err on the side of caution, we limit their screen time, we keep these devices, distance is your friend. So the further they get away from the router, the further they get away from these devices, it does limit their impact. And I think as a parent, the safest thing you can do to protect your children is just, heed that advice and, really limit their screen time.
Well, I remember when the cell phones kind of first came out, I'm sure you probably remember too. I remember like talking and like it would be so hot. The phones would be like ridiculously hot and your ears would be red. I mean, I hate to say it, none of us really thought much back then, right? And
Yep.
Now you look back and you go, well, how dumb was I? Like clearly that's probably not safe. I was talking to a grandparent the other day and they're like, well, this EMF thing, I mean, you guys are always finding new stuff. We didn't have that. Well, yeah, of course you didn't, because we didn't have the wireless. Not every child had an iPad or like we're, being held a cell phone. And I see this all the time. Like I'll be in a grocery market and then like a little baby is like just watching a YouTube thing, on their phones. What do you think about those little dot things? They have all these different ones out there that supposedly help kind of block that. Is that something we should look into?
Well, I think there's different ways that you can protect yourself and protect your home against different wireless devices. They build like little cages that you can put your router in that limits the electromagnetic output of your router. There are ways now that you can hardline your iPhone, your iPad. You can basically connect a connector to the phone to an Ethernet cable, and you just change the settings, and you can run all your calls, all your text messages through a hard line. They also have these, I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but basically you plug them into the wall. And what it is, it runs off your router and it runs through the electrical lines in your home. So instead of doing it wirelessly, it actually uses your electrical lines that are already built in your house to send that data. And then you can plug these in different rooms and then put a hard line into that. So we've got some great technology now. There's a company called Clearlight. And the founder of that organization has 2 boys on the spectrum, and he actually used to be a bigwig in technology. So their company has really been looking at developing technology that's safe for everyone, including children. His name's Peter Sullivan, if anyone wants to look him up. But I'm glad that there's somebody out there that's really trying to keep technology in the forefront, but do it in a way that's really safer for people. And they've got really high-tech stuff now where there's paint you can put on your walls to protect against EMS from the outside. They've got, copper sheeting you can put under your drywall. There's a film you can put over your windows. I mean, you can really go to great extents if you really feel like you'd like to or want to and can afford it. I mean, it's not cheap, but there is a way to really protect your home from all that external radiation. And again, if you live next door to a cell phone tower or a high tension wire line, I would probably be more apt to look into those type of protective technologies just to protect you and the whole family.
I love just, as we evolve, it's just always important that we keep talking about it and having those conversations and being open-minded. Now, before we wrap up, what are some tests that parents should do, or are there any specific when you're looking at specific infections?
So with infections, it's really a combination of different things. If we're looking at something like Lyme disease or strep, we can do that through simple blood testing. I do recommend, work with a practitioner who really understands these infectious things, because it is going to change potentially what lab you use. Some labs are better than others at trying to pick up certain infections. So if it comes to Lyme disease, we work with labs that specialize in tick-borne disease. Strep, you can probably run through any reference lab. But if you're looking at potentially like a stool pathogen like Klebsiella or Proteus, Pseudomonas, then you can do a stool test. I think Clostridia, if you want to look at that you would do an oat test, organic acid test. So often we're doing a combination of things, and it really just depends on the child's symptoms. If I've got a child who's got a lot of gut issues, we're definitely doing a stool testing and probably doing organic acid testing. If they've got, joint pain, problem with walking, low muscle tone, we might start looking at some of these other infectious agents. So between blood, urine, and stool, you can usually pick up everything you need to find.
And what can I give my child to help keep their immune system happy and primed to fight infections?
Yeah, so I have sort of a little cocktail that I recommend. It's safe for any child, no matter if they're taking medication, not taking medication. But I love the combination of vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin A, and zinc. These are nutrients that are all important for immune function, and you can give them at safe doses. My only caution with zinc is if you take zinc on an empty stomach, it can make kids a little nauseous. So just make sure they have a meal when they have their zinc supplement. But particularly this time of year, as we're rolling into winter, everyone's getting sick, and I've got a little bit of a bug myself today. So it's just happens, out there. So this is a cocktail that, I'll have parents just mix it into a little bit of dilute juice, mix it all together, take it with breakfast. And this is something you can give your child every day just to keep their immune system primed. And if they do start to look like they're coming down with something, you can just ramp up the doses a little bit until they get over the infection.
Same thing for parents too. I mean, you should
Yeah.
be doing this time of season trying to keep your immune system up as well. I know I'm doing that. Although I didn't know about the A. I knew about the C, D, and zinc, but I didn't know about the A. So I'm glad I'll add that to my regimen. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss before we wrap up?
No, I think, my take home message for parents is that, when you've got a child who's got all these immune issues, this really should be high on the priority list of trying to dig deep and figure out what's setting them off. You can just save yourself so much grief, time, and money if you know what's bothering your child. So I think it's worth the time and the investment to figure that piece out first, because then you might save yourself doing some other therapy or some other treatment that may not be as effective until you've dealt with these immune issues. So I would really just put that at the top of the priority list of getting that evaluated.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I know how busy you are. How do people find you if they want to see where you're at? Because you don't just work with people just in California. You work all over the world, correct?
Yeah, we do offer remote consultations for people who aren't able to come to beautiful, sunny California, although we do have Disneyland in our backyard. So yeah, if people are looking to find us, they can always call my office at 949-551-8751, or just go to my website at dariningelsnd.com, and all the information about myself and the practice is all right there.
And that's Darin, DARININGELSND.com.
Actually, ELS.
Oh, I messed that up. Oh, goodness gracious. Well, this day has just been one of those days. But hey, now they're not going to forget, so that's always good. So I'll make sure that they try to put that also on the screen so you don't have to count on me to spell it. Well, thank you so much, Darin, for being here today. And thank you guys for watching. And remember, there's always hope with a plan. And doctors like Darin Ingels are out there making sure to help guide us on that track. Until next time. Bye, guys.